Welcome to Chicks Who Fly, a podcast dedicated to women pilots and women in aviation. My name is Anaya and I am your host. I am a vocalist, DJ, producer, digital nomad, and a pilot. I have decided to stay active in the aviation community by doing this podcast, among other things. I plan to interview and feature women pilots and women in aviation and share their aviation love stories with you, as well as the ups and downs that they decide to share. In this episode 2 of Season 2 of Chicks Who Fly, I get to welcome back Kristi McFadden, CFI, CFII, and MEI. Kristi was also my flight instructor when I was in Santa Fe, still working on my private pilot certificate. Since this conversation happened, I have completed my private pilot certificate and I am currently working on my instrument ground school online, hoping to do my commercial certificate and my Seaplane Rating. In this episode, Kristi and I get to talk about the common challenges that student pilots are faced with. We talk about the things that she sees most commonly, and also we talk about some of the challenges that I had throughout my flight training experience when I was flying with Kristi and after I left Santa Fe. I think this is a particularly helpful episode for anyone who is a student pilot who is working on their certificates, and Kristi just has such a wealth of information and fantastic insight and advice for any student pilot. It was a great experience getting to interview Kristi now that we actually have met and spent time together. It was just a pleasure for me. So I hope that you guys enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed doing this interview with Kristi McFadden. If you are enjoying this podcast, please consider following, liking, sharing, subscribing, and perhaps checking out our Patreon page at Chicks Who Fly. Also, feel free to visit us and connect with us on our website, chickswhofly.com, and you can reach us by email at chickswhoflyofficial@gmail.com. So without further ado, here is the conversation that I got to have with Kristi McFadden.
Hey, I'm so glad to get to talk to you again and have you on.
I'm happy to be here, always.
So what's new and exciting since we last spoke?
Well, just doing the same old teaching and flying and experiencing everything I possibly can in the air. COVID threw a huge wrench in everything, so there's been quite a few shutdowns and changes of pace, which have made instructing a little challenging. But, yeah, it's going good. Just enjoying the aspects of where I'm at in aviation, which is always, I think, the best thing to be doing. But, it has its set of challenges as well when you're dealing with people who are stressing out about finances or stressing out about health and then, of course, each state is doing everything, each state's doing everything a little different, so that's weird.
Right?
How are you?
You can go across the border just, like an hour or however long it takes and have completely different rules. That is just kind of weird.
It is, and it makes it hard, like, from a flying standpoint, if I have anything that takes me out of state, supposedly, I'm supposed to quarantine when I come back, which is weird because aviation, you can be in a different state in the blink of an eye. And I know aviation has some different rules, but with flight instruction, I have to be conscious of my students and the fact that they're going into offices. So if we stop over the border, let's say we fly to Colorado or we fly to Texas, then legally they're supposed to, when they come back, quarantine. So it really, I don't know, it makes it difficult to plan things and do things appropriately. It is also good. How's boat life?
Boat life is kind of amazing. It's really beautiful here, and it's really interesting because the place where our boat is moored is literally on the old 1930s Pan Am seaplane-based runway.
Oh my gosh.
And there are a couple like little tiny deserted islands to both sides of me, and those are there because when they were building the runway for the seaplanes, they dug out a ton of sand and these islands got created.
That's so crazy.
It's crazy, it's interesting, and it's especially cool for me because, you know, being
ties
a
your two
pilot.
loves together. Yeah.
And on top of that, I saw for the second time, but for the first time in person, I was in my car the other day about to leave the marina, and a dinghy flew by, like a dinghy with wings.
Oh my gosh, that's so crazy. Like, explain it, because I'm trying to even imagine what it looks like.
So it's literally a dinghy with inflatable sides and a hard bottom, and they put glider wings on it and like a Rotax engine in the back.
Wow, that's just so bizarre.
Just wanted to send up a flare and say, hey, come down here. How can I buy one of them?
Right? Like, we need that attached to our boat.
Me too. And, you know, while we're all navigating, you know, COVID challenges and all the unique things that have come with this year, I could use a little fun. And what could be cooler than a flying dinghy? If I can't afford an Icon A5,
right?
I'm able to have a flying dinghy.
That's actually pretty creative, though. I mean, you have to wonder who came up with the idea, and if it's like, is it a thing or is it something somebody created? And
I called the company, so you're asking me while things are as fresh as possible.
Oh my gosh.
Basically, the company they make these little like pontoon kind of aircraft, and they can get pretty fancy and put like all sorts of avionics in, and then the aircraft will be about like $80,000 brand new, but it's like a teeny catamaran with wings. But then they have a lot of people who are upgrading from this old style flying dinghy, which apparently is more popular outside of the country. And you can get, according to the person that I spoke to on the phone, one of the used ones that someone has traded in for about $20,000.
Wow, that's not bad actually at all.
It's the coolest thing I've ever seen, but I'd like to keep looking around and see what I can find.
So do you have to have a seaplane rating then to fly it?
You know what? I meant to ask him that and I forgot to. So.
Yeah, that's really curious because, I mean, obviously you're taking off on water, so I would imagine you'd have to have your seaplane to do that legally. I mean, unless it can take off on land. I mean,
yeah, I don't know if you have to have like your glider pilot, you know.
Right. I mean, it has an engine.
500 horsepower, I think, is what he said when I was speaking to him. It seats two people. You just fly around.
That's pretty awesome, actually. It's kind of crazy to even like connect the two together because obviously you weren't on a boat when I met you. So it's cool to see it come full circle though, because I know that was part of your guys' dream.
This is true. And I had no idea how it was going to come together, but it keeps moving in the direction of coming together. And then I flew for the first time with someone over here. So I think I told you when I got to Dallas, everything was going great. I had a great instructor named Gabe, and the airspace was really different and the airplanes were different. So it took a few flights, and then we had 2 flights scheduled one day, so that the first one would be brushing up and the second one would be the potential solo. And that day, he woke up with a really bad sore throat. And we're in the middle of COVID, so I wanted to make sure it wasn't that. And so that day I flew with someone else as kind of a review flight. And then the next day when he had been cleared and everything, we flew together again to do the potential solo. We went to a nearby airport. we did a few laps around the pattern. The first like 2 or 3 were good, and then it was getting like really bumpy and windy, and we made the next landing a full stop. We pulled around and held short, and the airplane, the jet that was landing, reported that the winds at traffic pattern altitude were 49 knots.
My gosh.
At which point we said, okay, well, we're not soloing. Let's go back to Addison, and this is going to have to be continued some other time.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. I mean, Mother Nature always has a way of throwing a twist in things, doesn't she?
Yes, and when my instructor got sick, because it was so random, it was super frustrating. But I was going to have to keep going anyway. And so yeah, I started flying over here with this instructor that was recommended by a couple other pilots from the lift page. Also, the girl Morgan, the CFI that I was flying with when I first got here from Santa Fe, she recommended him and knew him, so I went and I flew with him last week, and I noticed there's a lot less rest. Like,
good.
I guess the proportion of time that I've spent flying is less significant, and also because I'm more proficient because I've been flying long. Dude, I have 70 hours, and I haven't even soloed.
I know, but you really honestly cannot compare hours, apples to apples. I mean, everybody who flies, like every student I've had come across my board, I have students, they are soloing in like 19 hours. I have students that don't solo till where you're at, even later sometimes. And it's all circumstance. You have to give yourself some grace. Like, you've had a lot of big breaks in your training, and that requires more repetition. You've also changed airframe types a couple times. That causes more need of learning before you can get to that solo, right? I mean, it does make a difference. But honestly, it's awesome to see, to feel it, right? To feel like when you started flying now, you're not rusty, that you're capable, and that the skill is starting to stick.
Well, and the airplane we're flying in is a 172 Mike model, so
cool.
Everything's very similar to Santa Fe, and it had so many hours in that type of plane. And he was really impressed about how I handled the wind, and it was like, this isn't wind.
You're like, you know what wind is? Go fly in Santa Fe with Kristi. She will teach you wind. Perspective, right?
Yeah, it was good. It was really good and valuable experience to make me a better pilot, even if it did mean that things took longer.
Yeah. Well, like I told you when you were here, there's no dollar amount or hour amount you can put on the experience you get flying in weather systems that you're going to fly in as a pilot. And if you've never had the exposure, you may not be capable of actually flying in them. And you may not know that because you go into it thinking, well, I'm a private pilot and I'm experienced and I'm capable. And then you hit Santa Fe's wacky winds over the runway and suddenly you don't know how to land. I think it's kind of blindsides people, which is why we see more accidents and incidents in airports that have squirrely weather patterns compared to, airports that have, lower winds and more calm and consistent days. I can't tell you how valuable that experience is going to play out for you over the course of your flight career.
It already is. And the other thing that this instructor was impressed by was how I handled certain things that were really a result of the high density altitude experience in Santa Fe. He's really tall and heavy, and right, and so you can feel the inequality in the airplane. And basically, when I take off in this airplane with this instructor, I have to treat it like high density altitude. So I rotate, and then I stay in ground effect a little longer before I start climbing away.
Nice.
And he didn't have to tell me that, and he was like, "Oh, but good job." And I'm like, "That's yeah."
You're like, let me just tell you a story. I flew when the density altitude was 10,000 feet at field elevation regularly.
I'm telling you, you have no idea how much of a difference that makes until you do.
Yeah, and it's why I encourage people. Any student I've had, no matter where they're from, like if they were students when I lived near sea level versus high density altitude, I tell them all the time that some of the best advice I was given as a student and also as a young commercial pilot was to go fly elsewhere, find places find environments you haven't experienced, and hire an instructor, take you up and show you the ropes in that location so that you could understand the differences and that it would save my life someday. And it really has, because, doing a mountain flying course, for example, not just an online, course where you're reading about mountain flying, which is good, but, tapping into an actual physical course where somebody's taking you up to the canyons and showing you how the winds affect the aircraft and teaching you how to judge when to enter, when not to enter, and when to call a flight, and how to avoid the tumbling winds on the leeward side of the mountain. And it's life-saving principles that as a pilot, we aren't really, I think, always guided towards, especially as a student pilot, because we're so focused on just hitting the private pilot license, hitting the IFR, hitting the commercial, getting the CFI, and moving in that linear direction. I think sometimes instructors and schools in general just forget to tell students that there is so much more minute and finessing of flying that you learn from flying in environments that aren't common to you. And book knowledge can only take you so far. Like, remember when you came here and you're like, oh yeah, crosswinds, I've had crosswinds. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, let's go up and I'll show you some crosswinds. And we had a good giggle, right? Like, we were like, okay, those are really crosswinds. And I get it, because prior to having flown in an airport with really heavy winds, my concept of crosswind was also kind of laughable. Like, I didn't understand how severe they could be and how important that crosswind landing is. So yeah, I'm super grateful. I'm always still sad that I never was able to reach the mark of solo with you while you were here due to the weather, but I also feel like you took away so much more, from here.
I really did. And my time in Santa Fe and with you as my instructor definitely propelled me many levels forward as a pilot and with all the skills necessary. It's just not the same. I was watching some YouTube video the other day. This guy is really funny. Lou Dix Aviation.
Oh, he's great. I love his stuff.
He's really funny. And he was like, let someone land on their first flight. And I was like, you're in Orlando. You're at sea level. There's no wind, and there's just no comparison.
It's true. It's true. I know. I've had people come here that, they're 20-year rusty pilots and they're wanting to get back into flying. And the last time they flew, they lived in California at the beach, or they lived in Oregon or Washington or Texas. And they come here and they're like, yeah, I figured it's going to take like an hour to get back on my feet, blah, blah, blah. And then we take off and their eyes pop open. It's amusing to watch the connection when people realize that it's a different beast flying here than it is flying, on the coast, for example. And not to say that flying around the beach doesn't have its own share of challenges. I mean, I know Miami and Florida, summertime, you guys have thunderstorms that crop up like right in the middle of the day, and you get turbulence and you get lightning and you get lots of wind that just kind of, it's visible in the distance. You see it coming, and so it's coming, but it does change the dynamic of what you're doing on that given day. And it is an issue there that we don't see in the same way here. Like, our thunderstorms in the summer aren't timed. You kind of can guesstimate when they're coming, but it's a different type of beast out in the desert. So
I guess I wanted to have you on because you have so much experience with so many different kinds of students. So I just wanted to ask you about particularly common sticking points and challenges for pilots and student pilots alike that you tend to see most often across the board?
Okay, so that's kind of a big question. Obviously, it's different with every student. And, I've never had any two students be exactly identical in their learning style or their flight capabilities. But commonalities, things that I see that are like the areas where students struggle the most, some of them are skill-based and some of them are actually mental, like how people think and how people react. So on the skill-based side, landing, it's the flare to touchdown. Flare to touchdown and flare to touchdown, adding a wind correction. Those two pieces are probably one of the areas where people struggle the most because it's never exactly the same every time you come into land. You're going to have a little bit of wind different. You might have a little weight distribution different in your aircraft. You might be flying with your seat a little too high or a little too low, so your visual might be different. And so there's always little nuances to that ground effect portion where you are kind of holding yourself over the runway to slow down and then flare and land. It also depends on airframe. When I'm teaching in a low wing, sometimes that's easier for a student than for somebody in a high wing, just because, not to say that they land prettier, because usually they don't, but the way that the flare is done is a little different in a low wing than a high wing in how it feels as a student. I mean, it's really the same principle, but it's the way that it looks out your window and the way that it feels in the aircraft is slightly different. So for me, usually the biggest skill-based hang-ups that I see for students are that final coming into land, and then learning how to actually judge for airports that don't have good visuals, the 45s for your turns, so you're actually flying a good pattern, and judging your distance from the runway. A lot of students either fly too close or fly too far away, and so they make their pattern either too tight or too wide. And so that can also impact the timing of coming in and landing, because it's all about energy management and pitch management in that aircraft and getting everything lined up the way you want it so that you're coming in just at the right power settings without too much energy left in your aircraft so that you can dissipate that energy successfully and touch down on your point. And for students, it's a lot. It's a lot going on at one time. You take off and cruise, you can get yourself kind of set and you're set. Coming into land, you're adjusting for all the variables, and then on top of that, if your instructor's training you properly, which I haven't seen an instructor yet not train this, you're scanning for all the other problems that could occur. For example, in Oregon, an elk, a deer, a coyote might run across the runway. We had that coyote on final once here in Santa Fe, like right at the edge of the runway, and had we been any lower, we would have had to execute a go-around because we would have hit it. So, there's all of the little pieces that you're scanning for, and the ground is rushing up at you. That to take off and going out to do maneuvers, the ground is a lot further away, and so you don't have this like subconscious concern about it and you. And so I think that plays a role in that, flare to landing portion. And students are often, I think, scared a bit about damaging the aircraft and hurting themselves and, not landing well, making a fool of themselves. I've heard students say those exact things to me. Like, I don't want to damage the plane, or I don't want to make a fool of myself. I don't want to bounce. I don't want to, hit hard. And it's kind of like a fight between doing what you need to do and also not being too self-conscious of the fact that you're not perfect yet at it.
As you know, being a musician as well, and I relate everything back to that, when you're playing music, it's very hard to do a brilliant, job if you're self-conscious. And as an actor, if there's always that get out of like being in your own head kind of thing.
Exactly.
And there's something else you brought up so I find that when I am doing my pattern now, like here, I guess I got used to how the glide slope lights are set up in Santa Fe so that they're more for jets. So you always come in a little higher.
Yep.
And here it's not like that. And then because I assume that this is also a common student thing, you want to keep some distance between you and the ground. I've been coming in like really, really high and having to lose a lot of altitude on final, which I've gotten skilled at managing, but I don't want to have to manage it. I want to fly a good pattern. And subconsciously I'm trying to stay away from the ground a little too much.
Well, and it's true, especially at the new airport. I mean, I don't know the runway width at your airport, but you have to think about the natural visual illusion as well. You know, in Santa Fe, we had a 150-foot wide runway for the majority of our runways that we were using. So it's wide. If you're flying into an airport that's got a 75-foot runway, right, or a 50-foot runway, then visually you are seeing something different. Or if you're flying into a runway with something wider, then you're going to feel lower. So you're going to make yourself higher to try to compensate. So I don't know what the runway visual difference is for that, but that does play a role. Same with upsloping or downsloping runway. You know, that law of primacy, it's kind of interesting, but the way that we learn first, it really does stick out throughout our training. So, for example, I always tell students this because it helps illuminate, like, it's not just you as a student, but even as a, you know, pilot who's been flying for, you know, over thousands of hours, like, I still have to remind myself to not dump and dive, because when I first started flying, I was trained at Yokota, Japan, and we were supposed to, as GA, stay 800 feet on final until we crossed the runway. So we would come in. Yeah, there was a road that actually cut right at the base of the runway, and they would leave the lights on so that the traffic could flow. And when we were coming in as small aircraft, because they, you know, felt that we could essentially land later on this, you know, 11,000-foot runway, and it would be no big deal compared to, you know, big, heavy, like C-130 or something bigger than that was coming in. So for us, they wouldn't turn the lights off, which meant that we would come in on final and hit about 800 feet and have to hold that altitude. And then the run would be under us, and we basically chop everything, power everything, and dive down. Not dangerously, but definitely not smooth like a normal approach on final. And it wasn't until I moved into instrument training that I realized that wasn't normal, because in private, that was how we were taught. On instrument training, we would be on an IFR approach, so they would use the lights because we'd be using the glide slope or the ILS, for example, to come in, and we had to be on that same proper slope for a normal final. So my natural tendency is to want to stay high and chop and drop, because that's how I was trained as a private pilot. And even now, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours later, I still have that natural tendency, like if I don't pay attention, I will stay high. So I'm always having to talk myself through the proper approach to come in. So I bring that up because, you know, you, for example, you've trained at 4 or 5 different airports now, 6 maybe. So you've had a lot of different airports, a lot of different profiles, but wherever you trained first and spent the most time doing approaches is what your natural brain thinks is like the way it should look. And everything else is you having to tell yourself it's different. And that doesn't mean you can't rewire it. Obviously, I don't come in high every flight, but when I'm tired or when I'm, you know, talking a lot with a student or something and I'm the one flying the approach, I have to be like double time aware of what I'm doing, because I naturally will, you know, sequence a higher approach just because that's how I did, you know, hundreds of my first landings. And so I think that isn't uncommon. But I also think that plays a role in why that like approach to final and that coming into land is so challenging for students, especially if they fly at multiple airports or with different aircraft, because that profile looks a little different in every plane.
Right. I discovered when I went to Dallas and I was still having trouble gauging when to flare and all that stuff, that I hadn't been, even though of course I knew that this is what I should do, I hadn't been looking down the runway. And I find that if I'm really keeping the proper airspeed and a stabilized approach, and then I transition to looking down the runway, that made it click for me. Like, I've been landing really great. I've had no more problems with ballooning up, and if I do, it's only a little bit, and I know exactly how to manage that. But I guess I had been so overwhelmed with everything else that even though I knew I was supposed to look down the runway, I wasn't.
Right. Well, and that profile out that window, it's critical. And I think, I know we worked on that, but we also had all that wind we were contending with. So a lot of times you were so busy doing all the other things that your view out the window would disappear. And I could usually tell because that's when you'd either yank or, kind of come in a little flat. But it's not, that's probably one of the biggest reasons I think people struggle with the approach to landing is the ground is so close. And if you're looking right off that nose of your aircraft, that's what you're seeing. And so you're not really judging how your airplane is behaving. What I always tell people is look at the horizon and imagine, look down the runway and imagine it's your horizon. And when your nose starts to sink, that means that you're sinking, so you rise up to meet it. So you just bring the nose back. And I'm always talking about, just rise up, pull it back, meet the runway. And you're watching it kind of I always think of it like a dance, just because like you, I'm a little more artistic and musically based, so I think of timing and rhythm when I'm flying. And so when I'm looking down that runway, I get into ground effect, and it's almost like ground effect, 2, 3, pull back, 2, 3, pull back, 2, 3, and back, touchdown. It's almost fluid like that, and it's almost no matter what airplane I'm flying, it's that feeling. But I'm using the reference down the runway to judge my pullback. Sometimes it's just pull back one little bit. Sometimes I have to pull back a little more depending on my sink rate and depending on the wind, depending on, a number of the other things that are impacting how my aircraft is slowing down and losing lift. But yeah, that looking down the runway is critical. One thing I do for students that really struggle with it is I get a dry erase marker and I have them put a little X on where that horizon is when they're flying, so that when we come in, they have that as an additional reference point.
Yeah, that's clever. And then there's something else that you mentioned earlier in this conversation, which is funny because what I was doing when you called was editing another interview that I did with a pilot from the Los Angeles 99s, and she's awesome. And a lot of the theme in my conversation with her was about how it's mental. Like, flying is almost like yoga in the sense that it shows you how you approach life. And what I found, and I was saying this in the interview with her, that when I was flying with you, who are like an adult who has kids and a husband, and you're an experienced instructor, I found myself just waiting for you to tell me what to do, even though I knew what to do. And I'd catch myself over and over, and it was really hard for me to just be like, I know what to do, and I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
Especially in landing. And then when I got to South Florida and I started flying with Morgan, I felt like it was more like I was learning to fly with like my cousin. You know what I mean? Whereas you have like a more maternal energy, even though I'm older than you. But, you have, this experienced and poised way of teaching, which made me naturally just defer to you, you know?
Yeah. I know. That one time I had to get on the phone because I had that student on his cross country and he was checking in and I needed to like answer his call because I wanted to make sure he was safe. And I just let you fly. Remember we landed and you were like, you were distracted and I did so much better. I said, I know. You just need to trust yourself. Like, you've got this. I
clearly told that story in the conversation that I was just editing.
Okay. Yeah.
And you were watching me and you were present, but the fact that I thought that I was on my own made all the difference.
Yeah. I mean, there's times with a lot of students, and you were kind of at that point. I was almost at the point where I was just going to be like, figure it out, fold my arms, let you do it. But the winds wouldn't allow that, unfortunately. They were just on that extra cusp of height. But a lot of students, I end up doing that. I get in the plane, and I fold my arms, and I'm like, yeah, save yourself. Like, of course, if they're going to kill us, I'll reach in and do something. But sometimes you have to have that. And it's true. Different instructors can pull out different reactions in us. And absolutely flying is a mental thing. So flying as a woman, especially, 9 times out of 10, or I should say 9.9 times out of 10, I'm flying with men, not women. It's very rare I get a female student, unfortunately. It's just the demographic that we tend to pull is more male. And so sometimes I have students who are in there and I actually have to fight them for the controls when they're about to kill us because they don't trust me because I'm a female instructor. And then I have people who, like you or other students who feel so safe that they don't trust themselves. And I have to like change how I teach them because I'm like, well, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? And you remember me saying that to you, like, okay, what's next? Okay, what's next? Rather than me saying, okay, you need to turn now. Okay, you need to put your flaps down. Like, you tell me what's next. If you're wrong, I'll tell you. But like, instead of me being the one prompting you each time. And it's a finesse because as an instructor, I want you to feel confident, but I also don't want to die. So there's that. I want us to be able to get up and fly the next day. But, there's a line, and there's a line between how you have to approach it as a student. There are times when my entire lesson is actually me sitting down with a student and talking about confidence because that's where they're at. They just lack it. And here's the thing. I'm sure there are guys and girls out there, women and men, who just have the moxie. They just do it. I wasn't born with that innately either as a pilot. And there were times I would I used to tell the DPEs, and this is kind of a funny story, so maybe it'll relate to people, but I used to have to tell the DPE when I'd get in for a check ride, listen, I ask you questions, but I'm not actually asking you questions. I'm actually asking myself. So don't answer. Because I would, the DPE would say, do a steep turn. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to do a steep turn, right? Okay, I am. Okay, I'm going to pull my power back. I'm going to turn. Okay, I'm going to hold my nose. I'm holding my nose, right? I would talk out loud like that, and it probably was super funny to the DPEs, but it was my dialogue I needed to ask and question myself and then answer myself to get that confidence. In the beginning, my instructors were like, are you asking me? And I'm like, no, not really, but yes, I am, right? I'm supposed to, right? I didn't have the confidence, so I would question everything. And I'd want them to tell me yes. Even though I knew the answer was yes, I didn't quite have that gut instinct or trust in myself that was the right answer. So I would say, that's what I'm supposed to do, right? Or this is the flow, right? And I'd want them to confirm, but at the same time in my brain, I knew I was right. I didn't have that confidence to really trust that I knew I was right. And it took time to build that. It took time. I had one instructor, one of my female instructors who's freaking awesome. And she was like, do you really need me to tell you yes? I will, but you don't need me to, right? And eventually she called herself Mr. Potato Head, and she would just sit there and not answer. And so, side note, and kind of silly, but one day one of those silly McDonald's toys I got one of my kids happened to be a Mr. Potato Head, and I literally brought it in for her, and I said, here, the next time I ask you a question, hold this up for me. And she did. And it kind of smacked my face, not in a bad way, but like, okay, listen, she's not going to tell me because I know this. And it was that kind of like give and take, like first the building up of my own confidence, and then somebody saying like, listen, I'm sitting next to you and I trust you, so stop asking. You've got this, you know.
Right. I don't know. It's crazy because with you and literally with everyone I've flown since, they're like, oh yeah, you're ready. Like it's such an easy to see thing. And I'm like, why are they telling me this? You know, until a certain point where I got it, but it was definitely after I left Santa Fe. It's just weird. And I think part of it it was really drilled into me as a kid because I grew up with a Vietnam veteran who was struggling and that then the house was explosive and violent sometimes. It's so drilled into me to be quiet and let other people take over because otherwise the results can be explosive and even unsafe, right?
Right, makes sense.
You don't realize that you're reacting to that until one day you realize it and it clicks and you don't do it anymore. But I think that had a lot to do with why it took me so long to realize that I did know what I was doing.
Right. Well, and I think you gained a lot of confidence here because you flew in a very challenging environment that you'd never experienced, and you were ready. Like, I mean, I remember we were going to solo you. If the winds hadn't been 26 knots, we were going to solo you. You were ready, and I knew you were ready, and you didn't quite know you were ready, but you trusted me that if I said you were ready, you were ready. And you told me that several times. I trust you. If you say I'm ready, I believe you. And if you say I'm not, I believe you. And I think as a student, there is a little bit of that necessity in your relationship with your CFI to trust them. When they say, I'm hopping out of the plane, you're ready, you're ready. And while you were here, you were collecting skill. You were collecting all the confidence I think you needed so that when you left, you'd be ready. And then it was just an unfortunate byproduct that you left and flew for a little bit and then had a break and then flew again and had a break. And now you're, I think, kind of going to get back in that groove. And you're ready. You know, I think when you start getting your feet under you there and you're flying more consistently, you're going to be soloing soon. But it is a matter of our own personal dialogue and our confidence. And you know, I've had students, every time people come back from their first solo, I ask them, tell me how it felt to be in the plane. They're like, it was amazing. It was awesome. It was a little scary. It was cool. It was so wonderful. It was a little scary. You know, like there was like this ebb and flow of like, oh my gosh, I'm doing it. And then, oh my gosh, I'm doing it in, right? You know what I mean? It's like the two sides of the coin. And I mean, I'll never forget my solo. And it's been over a decade since I've soloed. And I remember, you know, my instructor hopped out and I just sat there for a couple seconds and I was like, holy Toledo, I'm doing this. I can do this. I've got this. Okay. You've got this. Are you sure? Yeah, you're sure. Okay, let's do this. And then, you know, taxi and then to the runway and then the takeoff. And then as soon as the wheels left the ground, you know, like the chills, like, oh my gosh, I'm doing this. Oh my gosh. And then focus. It just like switched. Like, okay, you're doing it, so fly the plane. Like, stop freaking out about it in your brain. Do what you know you need to do. And, you know, and I had a unique first solo. It was bizarre, and, you know, I had a new ATC controller that sent me, like, had me leave the pattern. It was completely just not a normal solo, but I survived it, and it was fine. And I came back and felt like an aha moment had happened because that trust in myself had started to develop. And I still question myself frequently after that, but there was that like pivotal point in my training of recognizing that, okay, if he trusts me, my instructor, then I obviously am demonstrating capability. So I need to trust that capability. I need to trust him and trust the process and just follow the flow, follow what I know I'm supposed to do. You know, and it's important, I think, that you have that trust in your instructor, but I also think it's important that you build that trust in yourself too. And
yeah,
you know,
that's really like what I'm thinking when you're saying that is that's what you're describing is where I was when I left Santa Fe. I believed I could do it because I trusted you. And then in Dallas, that's when I realized that I could do it, and in part because that instructor just wouldn't tell me anything. Like when I was flying, he'd just really wait for me to figure out, because he could see that I clearly had a strong base after I had flown with you. So it was kind of time to receive different type of treatment.
Yeah.
And then I was suddenly found myself doing all sorts of things that I was never willing to do myself in Santa Fe, that I always let you do, just everything with the radio, and plus they were completely different avionics. They had a glass panel, and everything about it was different. And I definitely loved the no carb heat situation. But I remember we were going to a nearby airport to do the pattern practice, and he was like, well, we're going to this airport. What do we do now? And what do we do now? And where's the airport? And I always freak out because I always feel like the airport is under my frickin' nose, and I don't know the space. I can't see it even though it's right there. Please tell me, is there a trick? Because I'm still not so good at that.
Well, part of the trick is if you plug it into your GPS ahead of time, you get a general reference point on there, like direction to look. But some of it's just learning how to pick it out, figuring out what it should look like amidst a bunch of buildings or a bunch of fields or mountains, depending on what terrain you're flying in. And there's times, I'll be honest, there's times I'm going to an airport and I'm like, they're like, ATC's like, your airport's at 12 o'clock. Let me know when you see it. And I'm like, 10 miles later, are you sure it's at 12 o'clock? Because I still don't see it. But most of the time, I look at my GPS and I say, okay, well, it shows it at 12 o'clock and I'm not there yet. It's 5 miles ahead of me. I'm sure I'll see it. It's got to be there. So it's it isn't always easy, and I think some of it is, CFIs, I think we have a little fun with our students. I love to fly people places. Like, do you see the airport? And I know it's off their wing, and they're looking out the front window, and I'm just waiting for them to figure out that it's not out the front window, because it's funny, because I remember students, or, as a student, having my instructors do that to me. But it's also a teaching thing, because you have to realize things aren't always directly in your line of sight. Sometimes they're under your wing, or they're right in front of the wing, or they're behind you. And so part of asking you where it is making you think I need to scan better. I need to be more attentive to, my situation where I'm at. And kind of planning it, just like the emergency procedures when we, pull your engines, and we kind of do it at not the greatest times. We want to have that become something so comfortable and that you just know what to do, and you're just doing it without thinking. So that when the situation arises and you need to follow the flow, you've already established the confidence to do it. So I don't know. I love watching how other people teach as well as how I teach, and take notes and make changes myself as an instructor, so that I can create a better environment for my own students, but also because I like getting the whys from other instructors. Like, well, why do you do it that way? I'd like to know, because I'm interested in developing different strategies myself for my own students. But yeah,
right.
I don't know, it's interesting. But looping back to your comment about the mental aspect of flying, the other piece that I think a lot of people don't click onto is, the whole reason we have the I'm Safe checklist, the whole reason we talk about, the whole reason it's a buzzword in aviation about aeronautical decision-making and how we as pilots react to situations and hazardous attitudes, all of those things that are kind of squishy because they're mental aspects of aviation, they play a role even in our training. And so think about it from a student standpoint. If you're feeling like you just can't do it, then you're actually feeling resignation. And so you're not willing to take that step to believe that you can make a difference, which is the resignation antidote. Because you have a CFI saying, well, I'm here if you need me, right? But the CFI doesn't always want to take over either. And so it makes you sometimes doubt your capability because they're not willing to step in. And so you want to resign and you just want to like not deal with it, but you don't have somebody willing to pop in and take over. And so then it makes you more doubtful of your safety or your consistency or your capabilities instead of building up your confidence. And so I guess the reason I'm bringing this up is I really think it's important for students to be aware of the dynamic of their life, of how that is impacting their own training. So, I have kids. I've got things going on that have been very stressful in my own training or in my own work. And I am constantly kind of monitoring, is that stress actually subconsciously nagging at me? Is it in the background kind of pulling down a little bit on how I'm focused or on how I trust myself? Because, when you have things happen in your own personal life that impact your confidence or impact your stability or impact your sleep, any of those things, like any of the major buzzes, they bleed into your aviation and into your training, and they also bleed into how you form your confidence. And so, people who've had lots of failures in their past, they might be a little more mousy on taking control because they don't believe that they can succeed. And I have a lot of students who fall in that category who want to be pilots but have had a lot of setbacks in their personal lives, and it does impact how they learn. And you have to, as an instructor, I have to word things a little different and teach them a little different because I don't want to continue to undermine their capabilities by making them feel like they can't.
You want to be an enabler of that crutch.
Exactly. And you don't want to layer it. So, it's kind of like how we verbally talk to people. You can criticize somebody kindly, or you can criticize them very cruelly. There's like a whole spectrum in between those two. And it's the same thing in aviation when you're teaching. Like if someone's not doing something well, you can be like, well, that sucked. Or you can say, well, your yoke management was really good, but everything else we can build on, rather than that sucked. It's two different approaches. And for people who are super, super confident, sometimes they need the, well, that sucked concept to understand that they weren't doing it perfectly. So they're not being overconfident in their training the entire time. So there's, like I said, there's a balance. But I think back to when you were here and you had a lot of moving parts in your life while you were here in Santa Fe. You guys were debating when to leave, when to go. Could you find a boat? Like you had another whole plan, and we had, the uptick of the political unrest in the country and the stress of the COVID and everything else playing a role just on everybody's brain, not just yours, but everybody's brain. And so there is something to be said, I think, for understanding that in our training and understanding that in our own personal lives. And I don't think it's talked a lot about in aviation in general, just like mental health and our personal outlook in life isn't talked a lot about in most areas of work, or study. If you think about it, it's kind of mentioned, but people don't highlight it, and they don't recognize the impact it has on your growth and development or your training. So I bring it up because I think if students are listening to this, for example, and they're thinking, man, I just don't feel confident. Well, run down your list of why. Why aren't you feeling confident? Is it that you don't know the maneuver? Is it that you don't know the process for the maneuver? Is it that you've had, a setback at work, and so that makes you feel less confident? So when you get in the plane, you're kind of stressing about that too, and you're trying to focus on your maneuvers, but you have this little, nag in the back of your brain kind of reminding you that you didn't do something right somewhere else. And is that playing a role in how you're approaching your training? And I'm not saying everything always ends up something from your life affecting your training, but, our confidence and our way of dealing with life, I think, is tied a lot to the little intricacies that we sometimes overlook or push to a corner because we're so focused on trying to achieve something that we're not willing to address them. And if you don't have the ability to manage that stably in the air, at some point, it's going to be too much.
Right. No, that reminds me of this Air Safety Institute, AOPA Air Safety Institute.
Oh, I love their stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's one that was particularly horrible because this pilot didn't realize how much his father had died, and he went flying with his son, like I think a week less after his father had died. And he didn't realize how much that was on his mind. And unfortunately, I think what it was, I don't know if it was when they were taking back off in the seaplane, I think he forgot to retract something and it caught in the water, flipped the plane over. He somehow managed to get out, but his son drowned, his tiny son.
Oh my gosh.
And this was like a week after his father had died. And obviously that had to be affecting him. And he probably just didn't realize how much his father's passing was affecting
impacted him. Yeah. So, well, and like big life events like that, deaths, losing a job, divorce, things that are extremely, negative and can cause mourning or cause, a lot of sorrow. Usually for me, like I've had several students have somebody pass in their family during flight training, and I tell them, I don't want to see you for a month. No offense, but at least give yourself a month to mourn. And usually they're still not ready at a month. I have one student, his son passed away almost a year and a half ago now, and he's still not flying. We see him. He comes in regularly and says hi, but he's mentally and emotionally not stable. And he knows it, and he's willing to talk about it. But, originally he wanted to get right back in the airplane. And I was like, I'd love to fly with you, but I don't think it's worth your money, first of all, or your safety, second of all, because I don't think you're mentally in the right place to be in the airplane. And he argued a little bit with me, and then like 5 seconds later he was crying. And then he's like, you know what, you're right, I'm not ready. And I was like, I'm not trying to be mean. I said, I will gladly take you up, put you in the back seat, and fly you around. Like, you can be a passenger and relax and enjoy the flight aspect. But as a student, it's not the right time for you to come back to fly. And when you are ready, I'll be here to teach you. I reassured him, like, I'm totally here to teach you, and I'm ready when you're ready, but you need to heal first. And it's a really hard thing for people to recognize, that when you've lost something, you have to give yourself time to heal. Especially like for me, airplane's my happy place, right? Like that is I love to be in the air. But even I know that there is a point where I'm just mentally not safe, and I shouldn't be. No matter how much I think I'll love being up there, I know it's not the right place to be. And but it's hard. I mean, how do you tell yourself that, right? How do you draw the line in the sand? How do you make that decision? And unfortunately, some people don't, or they don't think it all through, and they end up with a tragedy on their hands. And it's hard, but going back to our own training, like think about you now, where you're at now, things have gotten to a better kilter for you. You're in the boat has occurred. You've got that thing off your list. It's not on your brain as much. And sure, you still have stress. Sure, you've still got stuff you're thinking of in your life, but now your brain can change gears and focus more maybe on flying, which might show more results, like better results and quicker, competencies and confidence, simply because you have less stress kind of hanging over your head.
Right. And that's why those checklists such as I'm safe exist, but we have to utilize those tools as pilots. And plus, losing a child is undescribably more devastating than losing anyone else that you really care about. It's because
Absolutely.
it's so.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, well, I have, like I said, this was a son. I've had another one lose his mother, to COVID actually. And that's hard. It's hard to it's hard to watch them suffering as an instructor. I want to help my students, obviously, and it's hard to tell them no. Like, I'm sorry, but it's not the right time for you to fly. And it sounds weird for me to make that decision because I'm not the one going through the I'm safe checklist. But when I can visibly see how it's impacting them and they aren't recognizing it, it's, I have to step in and be like, no, we're not going up. At least not as a student instructor. I will happily take a student up and let them fly, but in the back seat. Like, I will happily take them up and give them a lesson on not flying, if you will. But it's not worth the money. It's not worth the investment, obviously. And it's a hard place to be. But this day and age, we have a lot. We have a lot on our plates in general as human beings. And piloting takes a lot of mental energy, takes a lot of emotional energy in some ways. Like, we're not robots. We're definitely not like water bottles being produced by a manufacturer. We're humans. And so we have all this myriad of emotion and feeling. And even if we don't allow it to surface, it's still there. And it's still, in our minds. And so, those checklists are, I think, critical. And again, I think not always pushed. We talk about them in aviation. We mention them. But, like, I make my students tell me their I'm safe checklist. Like, come on. Like, I think we did that a couple times. Like, how are you on the I'm safe checklist? Like, you're not ill, you're not drinking, you're not, haven't had medicine. Where's your stress level? Where's this? Where's your fatigue? We talked about fatigue a couple times too. Just because, if people aren't sleeping well, then they're already diminishing their capabilities as a pilot. So, that's the other aspect. Like, when I think of the things students struggle the most with, it's either the skill set, and primarily as a beginning student, it's the landings. And then on the other side of it, it's the comprehension of where your confidence is and building your confidence, and then also recognizing when you need to call a flight for your own personal reasons, and being confident doing that, which is hard. If you're a people pleaser, for example, it's really hard to let your CFI down, like to not show up and to cancel, especially if your CFI is a contractor, for example. Bigger schools, CFIs usually have some sort of salary, or some of them have pay on the ground. Like, if their student cancels, they can still get paid for that time frame. But on a smaller scale, like if you have a small flight school you're going to, that CFI is very likely a contractor. So you don't show up, they don't get an income for that hour and a half to 2 hours they would have flown with you, or longer, depending on how long your block was. But in the end, like, as a CFI, I would rather lose that money and have my student make a smart decision to not come in, because I want them to trust that decision. And if I'm second guessing it for them, then they're never learning to have the confidence in that decision for themselves.
Right.
So it's a fine line, because if you, like, I have several students who I know are people pleasers. I can tell it in their personality, and they feel awful, and they always try to push coming in even when they shouldn't. And I have to remind them, like, no, it's okay to cancel. Like, this is a good reason to cancel. Don't come in. And then, they always feel bad. I'm so sorry. I wish I could. I don't want to miss it. And I always have to remind them, like, no, you are PIC. This is a good decision. Trust it. And so we have to tell ourselves that sometimes too. Like, I have to tell myself that when I've had to cancel, like, a commercial job, like, I'm sorry, this isn't safe. We can't go. Or I'm sorry, I'm sick. I can't fly today. I am really sorry. But it's not going to happen. And I am sorry, but I also know I'm not going to push that envelope and try to do something dangerous or fly when I'm mentally not capable of flying or fatigued. Like, the fatigue thing is a hard one too, because you want to work, but you're tired and exhausted and maybe haven't slept for hours and hours. Well, there's a point where it's dangerous and you really shouldn't be flying, right? So
well, it took me a long time to get there, because as a performer, it's a completely different mentality. It's like, my toe is broken. It doesn't matter. The show must go on,
Right. I have no voice, but I will sing like a lounge singer today because I have no voice, but you want me there. Yeah. I mean, it is hard, and it's because in musicians especially, you have to be a people pleaser. Your crowd is your people. Your job is your people, and you have to please them. You have to show up and you have to do it. And, we're very much like that in aviation in a lot of ways. We're there to serve who we're there for. We're there to fly the people we're hired to fly, or instruct the people we're there to instruct. or we promised our cousin a ride in our airplane and we feel obligated because we can offer that and we really wanted to do that for them. But we as an industry, I mean, fatigue probably leads to a lot more accidents and deaths than we even have statistics on because, right? I mean, think about how exhausted you are after flying 2 hours or 3 hours in a student.
You remember how I used to come out of, like, when we had particularly strong winds, we'd get down and debrief, and I couldn't stop yawning.
Yep. Yeah.
It is the most energy-hungry organ in the body, and people don't understand that.
No, and flying takes so much mental power. I mean, there's all sorts of things running in our head as pilots all the time. You know, our scans, checking our instruments. Is something off? Is it not off? How's the weather? What are the winds? How are my passengers? What is the airport environment like I'm going into? Am I ready to go in? Have I gotten clearance? Have I not? What are the other people doing? Where are they? I mean, that's like a constant dialogue in my head when I'm flying. Everything is always kind of scanning and running and flowing in my background. And so you add to that fatigue, and your mental capacity when you're tired is already diminished. And now you add workload. Maybe you got diverted. Maybe there's a storm. Maybe your passenger's throwing up in the back seat. You know, like there's all these other things that start to add up that increase that workload. And at some point, you're so tired you can't stay on top of it, right? And, you know, we talk about work overload and we talk about fatigue in aviation. It's part of, you know, the private pilot curriculum. It's in the instrument, it's in commercials, in ATP. I think every, you know, training I've ever done has talked somewhat about, you know, aeronautical decision-making and our physiology. But we talk about it, but we don't always want to admit that it's a risk for us, which is a little macho, really, right? Like, you know, maybe a little invulnerability in there, but.
Definitely. Yeah, and the other thing that you mentioned is for some reason I always get to the emergency procedures checklist last, and it's hard for me to retain it. And I think part of it is that everybody does it like really differently, even if it's a slight difference in the airplane. I remember at Thrust Flight Academy in Dallas, their emergency descent and loss of engine power was really different than the checklist that I used to do with you. And I remember it took me really long for you to be like, you lost your engine, and for me to actually like
do something.
Actually, whenever I get to a new instructor, it's always the same. You've lost your engine. I'm like,
Well, here's the thing. You know, I think as a standard, I mean, maybe the checklists vary a little, but it's always the ABCs. Like, if you lose an engine at altitude, you're pitching for your best glide speed, you're picking a best landing spot, and then you're getting the checklist. The checklist is always third, because if you're like 600 feet above the ground when you lose your engine, you're not going to have a lot of time to do anything. If you're if you're doing pipeline patrol or some sort of job where you're low flying, you're not going to have time to get to that checklist. It's basically just secure your aircraft and land. But when you're at 3,000 feet AGL and you lose an engine, I mean, remember we timed it a couple times because you were like, it just feels like it goes so fast. I'm like, okay, hold on, let's just time it and I'll show you. And there were times, you know, we were 5 minutes almost in the air before we were even at our 50 to 100 foot mark above the ground. So there's, you know, time. But the checklist, I don't think of the emergency checklist. You should memorize it if you can. I think it's good to have it memorized. But in an emergency, you have a probability of forgetting what you've memorized, right? We remember flow. So creating a flow for the aircraft that fits the aircraft, and it does change per airframe. You know, every aircraft has a different flow. But I also think of the emergency checklist as a redo. Like, you know, hand it to your passenger and have them run you through it as you're doing it. Or get it out. Like I always had you get it out and put it by your yoke, right, which was difficult with the bumps. But having it handy and having it ready and then walking through it every time. And the more you walk through it, the more consistency you'll feel on it. But that is hard, and it is hard when you're changing aircraft. But, you know, I've flown a bunch of airframes, and those emergency procedures are relatively similar. It's, it's always about, if you've lost your engine, the first thing is to get yourself the most time to try to troubleshoot. The most time is going to be your glide speed. And then because you may not be able to fix it, a place to land that you're aiming toward. So those two things need to be done right away, because if you get that checklist out and you don't pick a landing spot, you might be over the water by the time you got through the checklist and have nowhere to land. So it's itemizing priority, plan, prioritize, and it's kind of like we always want to have things in a proper sequence. And so you get that checklist out, and then you go, okay, I already have my glide speed, I already have my landing spot, so the next thing is to see if I can start it again. So how do we check? Well, what are the things that could have gone wrong? And so, like, when you're thinking about emergency standards, it's always about breaking it down from what could have gone wrong and what can you control as the pilot, because there's some stuff you can't control, right? I mean, there's things we can't change. So we have to work with what we can. And it is tricky, like the engine failure, the emergency engine out. I always, my big thing for students is just to get that glide speed and find a spot to land and start, trust yourself to get there, like aim and go. Because the biggest thing, and I think you did this a few times, but I have a lot of students who do this, is, they pick a landing spot that's unrealistic. Like they're not going to get there from the altitude we're at. And so then that leads to somebody either trying to stretch that glide speed, in other words, going slower than they should, or not having a safer spot before that to land, where if they had just turned, 180 degrees, they would have had a wide open field, for example. So,
it's hard to pick a landing spot, especially, at least in Santa Fe, there was a lot of other than congested area.
Yeah, thank goodness. A lot of open desert.
Yeah, but that's, that wasn't the case in Dallas. So when we'd go through emergency procedures and I'd have to pick a landing spot, it was like, I have no idea.
Golf courses, parks, and straight roads, if you can find, I'm always kind of hesitant with roads because there's usually lots of traffic in big cities. But, if that's your last option, But yeah, and power lines, roads have a lot of other nasty things that can be around them. But in big cities, so maybe this is kind of piggybacking on that. One of the other things when I am teaching in bigger, more congested areas is even in non-congested areas, honestly, no matter where you're flying, and I know we talked about this, but while we're flying, my brain is always cataloging a safe landing spot. So if if I take off out of an airport and I look out in front of me and I see a golf course and I think, if I lost my engine, that's where I'm going. I've already made my decision, so I just keep flying. If my engine doesn't fail, I keep flying. If it fails, I have a plan already. If I've passed that golf course, but there's nothing out ahead of me, I know I have some time where I can safely turn back and get to that golf course. So it's behind me, so I'm telling myself, okay, it's behind me. And then I think, okay, well, I'm too far now to make it, so what's ahead of me next? And I'm always kind of like balancing the what's ahead of me versus what's behind me landing spots as I'm flying.
Right.
So, it is a skill. It's a thing you kind of have to train yourself to do, but the longer you fly and the more you train, the more natural it becomes to pick out spots that are a little bit safer. And honestly, when it comes to big cities, you're very limited. Like when you fly over Albuquerque, for example, or Portland or Seattle, like you are limited. There are a lot less options. So you have to start picking earlier when you're not planning for it, so that if it happens, you've got a plan, and then you trust yourself to get there. You have to have that confidence in the emergency to just do what you've been trained to do, which as a student pilot seems very difficult. But I promise you, the longer you practice it, the less difficult it feels, because the reality is the process, and the process is follow the procedure and fly the airplane to the ground. Just don't stop flying. You fly it with whatever it's got for you, whether it's got an engine or not. You use whatever's left in that aircraft and get to the ground. And, I think if you watch some of the Survivor and NTSB report or air safety reports, a lot of the times the decisions they made were based off of a gut instinct, like, I know this is right, I'm doing it, rather than like really methodical thinking. It was, I've been trained to do this, this is what I need to do, and I'm doing it. And so it's almost like following the flow and your gut telling you to do it versus like sitting in the airplane going, oh, I've lost my engine, what do I do next? Okay, well, is that the right choice? I don't know. Like, we don't have time for that type of dialogue in an emergency, right? So I'm always fascinated by that. And, when I've met people who've had, issues like engine fire, engine failure, gear failure, I always ask them, like, so how did you handle it? What did you do? Tell me more. Like, I want to know, because hopefully that'll be in my subconscious. So if I get into that same situation, I have some resources in there to pull from that are a little different from just my training.
100%. That's super valuable. And it is. It's just, for me, I always felt like a need to memorize it, because when I read it and it's bumpy,
not always a great recipe for success. But here's the thing. That's because you're in training too, right? In a true emergency, you don't know how your body's going to react. You might be in bumpy conditions but not feel sick at all because you're so focused on the emergency that your other senses have kind of shut off. So, yeah, I know it's hard. But
only situation in which I've come close to having any kind of air sickness, because I have kind of a lead stomach. But yeah, trying to read when it was that bumpy and trying to follow the checklist that I'm somehow reading, that was challenging.
It is. Well, and there's a lot to be said for having the process memorized, right? Like, if you have the emergency process memorized, you get that checklist out. You don't have to read it. You can do and then verify that you did it. Like, do 3 steps and go back and make sure you did all 3 and then move to the next 3. Means less reading, which is good. But there's a point where you don't know how your brain's going to work. It may short circuit. You may not remember what to do. If you've never trained yourself to take the checklist out, then it's not a habit. So it's another couple seconds of trying to tell yourself what to do, where if it's already habit, ABC, airspeed, best landing spot, checklist, you're already making that motion like a sequence, a habit. So then when you're in the situation that you actually have an engine failure, it just flows. You don't think about it. You just do it because you've already trained that. And then if the checklist is memorized and you know what to do, you may already go into the flow of checking that the fuel selectors, on and or both and not off, checking that, that your mixture's set, that you're, in and out, checking your throttle, like going through the process. If you have carb heat, checking your carb heats in, pulling it out, putting it back in, seeing if there's any changes. Like for me in the Cessna especially, there's like an L that you do, and it kind of flows up from the bottom, like bottom up, and then from left or from right to left. And then if you're shutting everything off, you kind of follow that same flow to shut everything off. And so if you find the flow and match it to the checklist, then the two things together kind of create a sequence to keep you calm while you're working through the emergency. And I mean, that's kind of the most critical part, right? I think the biggest reason emergencies occur in people, well, I shouldn't say the biggest reason because there's lots, but I think one reason that some emergencies end in death is because the pilot freaked out, lost control, lost their capabilities, lost their faculties, didn't follow the flow, something, and they just gave up in a sense. They stopped flying the airplane. And, I don't think all accidents are that way. I think a lot of accidents, pilots do their best. They try to get everybody to the ground safely. But, in those last few minutes, none of us really know what's going through the pilot's mind. And for me, I want to be training myself and my students that you always think of it as just another event. Like, oh, the engine failed. Okay, what are we doing next? Like, let's move on. We have a process. And that way, hopefully, that type of instinct kicks in instead of the fear and the stress. I think when we were doing the emergency failures, I used to tell you, it says brief your passengers, right? Well, the wording you use is going to make a big difference on how they react. So instead of like, oh, we just lost our engine, we're going to crash, right? You're like, so we are going to be coming down to the ground with an engine out, but no big deal. I practice this all the time. It's going to be a little bumpier because we're landing off site. So I want everybody to buckle their seatbelts real tight. And like, I know it sounds silly to make it that kind of like dramatically fun, but the idea is when you're in the situation and you're like, hey, engine failure just occurred, so don't worry. I know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to be landing. We're landing this field. Here's what I need you guys to do. And you're like, kind of keep your calm and fly, right? I think some people never are taught how to brief their passengers in an emergency. So an emergency happens, they don't know how to tell the passengers that there's an emergency. Not that you have to, by the way. I mean, it's completely okay for you as a pilot to isolate your comms, talk with ATC, and deal with the emergency without alerting the passengers. But if you have to have an off-site landing, at some point they need to know that you're not landing on a runway. So you can't just like spring that on them after you touch down. So it's kind of like
Sully. I remember Sully never said anything until he just said, "This is your captain, brace for impact."
Yep. And sometimes that's all they need. But like I think about our small aircraft, for example, a little Cessna. You got 4 people in there headed somewhere for a weekend getaway. And somebody might have their iPad out and they might have, their seatbelt kind of loose. And they might not be as attentive to the safety aspects. So for me, I'd be like, can you please stow all your belongings? Can you please buckle your seatbelt really tight? Make sure that you don't have any wiggle room in your seatbelt. Prepare to open our doors before we touch down. Like there's like a sequence that we want to follow, and there's a benefit to not saying anything because your passengers are going to freak out if they know what's going on, right? If they think it's going to kill them, and that can cause more problems in the cockpit. But at the same time, in a small aircraft, if you start going down, it's pretty evident that you're not climbing anymore or that you're not, you know what I mean? Like it's, I don't know. It's really hard to pull the wool over your passengers' eyes that you're not going up anymore or staying level, that you're really coming, closer and closer to the ground and not by an airport. So my logic is the more calm you keep the cockpit and the more calm you are with your passengers, the more calm they're going to feel, the more confidence they're going to have that you're going to get them through that. And that will make the event safer because they're not freaking out and adding to your workload and your stress. Fly the plane, right? But I joke, whenever we practice engine failures and I get to the passenger brief, I always try to make it kind of silly. I'm like, all right, so our engine decided to quit. So we're just going to have to put it down over here in this field, but that's okay because there's some cows over there, so we've got meat if we need it. It's like totally nonsensical and kind of silly. And then I talk about later, like a real good briefing, like how you should do it and keeping it calm and focused and giving assignments if needed, like to your pilot or passenger sitting next to you. When I tell you to, I want you to pop your door. Like this is the thing I need you to do. So that they have a plan of attack as well, and a plan of what they should be doing once the event occurs. So I don't know. It sounds kind of silly to talk about it because we all hope that we never have an engine failure, but it happens. And
well, there's things that you hope to never have to use, but that's no reason to not hone those skills as much as possible because of what they can prevent.
Exactly. I mean, preparation is everything in aviation. It's why it's so important that we know how to plan and prioritize things so that we can sequence it properly. So it's a critical piece that we learn, but sometimes we don't even realize we're learning it. But yeah, I think it is hard sometimes when you're switching between schools and airframes and instructors. There's always a little bit of difference between each of them. So as students, I think it's really important that you kind of build your own trust in yourself first as well, because those instructors are there to guide you, but in the end, it's always going to loop back to you as a student and your willingness to really see both your strengths and your weaknesses and work on them. Yeah,
100%. I'm going to have to go. I fly tomorrow again. We were going to fly today. Winds are cuckoo. And he just said he needed to fly with. Everybody says the same thing. I just need to fly with you once or twice, and then I have to do certain maneuvers with you personally by law, and then we'll call you. So I'm there for like the 3rd or 4th time now.
Yeah. I know that is, I mean, there is something to be said for continuity. You know, I know you haven't had the luxury of being able to stay in the same spot and train, but you know, that is probably partly why it's taken you so long to get where you're at. And, you know, you've seen a little more money out the door because of it. The continuity aspect does help because you're not changing. And legally, as an instructor, we can't sign you off for solo until we've done all the pre-solo check requirements. You have to do those with us in our airframe at the airport you're going to be soloing at. And so it kills me when I have to do that for somebody who I know was ready prior to coming to my location, because I legally can't sign them off until I've verified that they're safe and that they can do it, you know, and that they've done the pre-solo test and all the pieces that go into the FAA requirement to get the student signed off. So I know, but I have good feelings. Like, you're in a good space, you're in a good spot. You know, you don't have as much craziness going on, like trying to figure out the wheres and the whys now. So I think just in general, you're in a really good place for flying right now. And I think that's important for all students. It's hard. It's hard to find a good place, but finding your spot and then hammering it out when you can, I think it will really help.
That's a good instructor too. I've been really lucky ever since you.
Thank you.
Everyone I've had is really great, and everybody has brought a little something different to the table. But I think here's what I struggle with in Florida after learning it differently in Santa Fe, because we don't have that density altitude. And that is, I'm putting in too much, well, I fixed it in Addison, but I was putting in too much power for steep turns, because in Santa Fe, you just have to, in order to not descend.
Right.
I was putting in too much power and doing the steep turn, like it was just getting much too fast.
Well, that, and, you know, flying out here this time of year, you wouldn't have that same problem. VA is great right now because it's cold and it's like nice dense air. And so you don't have to use full power like you would in the summer out here. But that's, you know, where that steep turn song comes in. You know, it's, you know, first you've got to roll it and you've got to pull it, then power, 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 trim to hold it, you know, if you're going to trim. Some people don't. But it's the concept of adding things as you need them and then just maintaining and managing. But that's awesome that you found the trick for that location.
Steep turns are what I feel least confident about, as well as the emergency checklist. But I had memorized the flow of the emergency checklist when I was with you. And in Dallas, it was different because no carb heat. And then some of the stuff was like over by the ignition that, you know, I couldn't have the same flow. But now I'm back to the same type of airplane, so maybe that'll be that. And I know that tomorrow he'll probably want me to do steep turns, so I better watch a video or something.
Watch a video, but also just sit down and think about it. Just, you know, if you're at 45 degrees and you're climbing, you can pull your power back a little bit. If you're at 45 degrees and you're descending, you can add more power. But also, where's your management in your yoke, right? Because it's all about, you know, the FAA standards is all about holding your airspeed, your altitude, your bank angle, and then rolling out, you know, close to your heading. So, like when I'm teaching them and when I'm telling students to practice it on the ground, I want them to be thinking about, if I'm rolling into 45, where is the point that I really need to be thinking about the nose trying to drop? Well, it's after you get close to that 30-degree mark, because that's when you start to see an exponential change in that vertical and horizontal lift. So add the power, right? So you roll it and you start to pull to give the back pressure first. Then you add power. It's not throw the power in while you're rolling, because that's too soon. So if you think about like the management of each piece and kind of try to get a rhythm. I mean, you're a musician, so rhythm I think works better for you, right? So think of the rhythm of the flow into that maneuver. It's not jerky and quick. It's all very smooth and fluid, and it's all about putting the pieces in when they're due. So for me, like, I know when I'm at a lower density altitude airport, I don't need full power. So if somebody just shoves that throttle in, it's going to be way too much. And what's going to happen is they're either going to see an increase in airspeed because they're going to have to pitch forward to counteract it, or they're going to climb, one or the other. So knowing how to manage that power setting is part of it, but it's all dependent on the day and how the aircraft is behaving with the atmosphere you're in. So, it's not like you can always set it to 2,200 RPM and it's perfect, but you'll probably start seeing a range that's consistent for your steep turns.
It's just a specific formula. If you do it exactly like this, but flying, it's just not that freaking simple.
No, flying is all about, I always say, about the nuances. There's always these little nudges here and tips there and pullbacks here that are what you need to do. And it's really about feeling and seeing the results. And so, looking out the window and watching that horizon. And if your horizon is rising up, well, you're sinking. So you're seeing the wrong result with what you did. I know we did this when you were here, but if you get it all set up right and trim it, you can take your hands off the yoke and it'll turn at 45 degrees without you doing anything. I mean, I think that's the best time when you've got it is when you can take your hands off the controls. Obviously don't completely take them off, but just not be doing any work. And the aircraft's doing exactly what you trimmed it and powered it for. And so, obviously there's still going to be small changes you have to make as the airflow around the aircraft changes. You might hit a bump here or there, so you're not ever really fully keeping your hands off. But on a really smooth, clear day, you can do 45s just sitting there in the aircraft making hardly any changes at all. So, so I know you're going to do good. I know you have the information. It's just time for you to go out there and trust that you can do it.
Yeah, well, I'll go so that I don't freak out, because I know he's going to probably want to see that, and he's probably going to want me to do the emergency procedures, because last time with our first flight, we just went to Homestead from Tamiami, which is Miami Executive Airport. It's so close. I'll send you a video too. It's kind of like the Wild West, because Homestead is uncontrolled, and there was traffic right next to us.
I get a lot of people here.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And one time in Dallas, when we were doing steep turns, we just kept going around and around and around and around, in one situation until I felt comfortable, which was freaky because then their traffic system thought we were traffic, but it was really just us.
Yeah, it was catching your ghost, basically.
Yeah, but it was cool because we kept hitting our wake over and over. So
yeah,
hopefully I'll do good tomorrow. But I definitely kind of have to screw my head on a little bit because I am dividing my energy between boat stuff and flying. But
yeah,
it's more manageable now because of what you said earlier. I don't have a deadline of when I have to leave. We are still thinking about when to leave here in the boat.
Right. Yeah, but you're not in that rush anymore where you feel frantic, like you've got to get there and you've got to get it done and you've got to, you don't have to make a decision, thankfully, yet, but I do think it would be smart.
All right. Is there any last advice? I've kept you on the phone for ever. So is there any last advice or thoughts you want to leave us with?
Definitely. I do have to go because I'm going to teach at ground school in a second. But, okay. So last advice, something that I kind of say this a lot, but you have to find yourself in aviation, and it's different for everybody. Everybody has a different why. Everybody has a different reason for becoming a pilot. But what I mean by finding yourself is you have to find your confidence, and you have to find what makes aviation your thing and trust that you're capable. And that's tough, but it's completely doable for a student. And when you find that you have that confidence, then it makes sequencing skill sets a little easier because you trust that you know the process. And finding a good instructor, finding a place that you feel like is supporting your aviation goals, that's also really critical. And sometimes you have to sacrifice one for the other. You have to find, a place that lets you be confident so that you can then find the instructor that matches that. But my best advice for students is just to not give up and ask lots of questions, and don't doubt that you can. Doubt that, you may not have the answer yet, and then make the answer your priority. And then, like we mentioned earlier in the conversation, start really being more attentive to what's happening in your own life and how that might be impacting your learning, and give yourself some grace when you have a lot on your plate. I've got students who are in finals and they're, stressing about their grades in school on top of trying to get ready for a cross country, for example. And that's a lot. It's a lot for people when they're still learning. So allowing yourself time on the ground when you'd rather be flying so that you can fill yourself up so that when you're flying, you're getting the most out of it. And, recognizing when you're pushing the limits of your own fatigue and your own I'm safe checklist, and being okay with canceling and being comfortable with canceling, because it's hard. It's hard to do that because, you're letting somebody else down, your instructor usually, but later on your clients if you're commercial. But you need to be okay with that because you have to be able to be PIC, and confidence is all built from making decisions and seeing good results from those decisions. Anybody that listens to your podcast, if they've got questions and they would like to have a second opinion or thought on it, have them send it in, and we can always knock out questions people have, and I can give my little Kristiisms on them, and they can ruminate in their brain, I guess. But yeah, anything, anytime.
Thank you so much for everything.
Of course. Hey, anytime, babe. I'm here for you.
And that concludes this episode of Chicks Who Fly. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I hope that you have enjoyed these conversations as much as I enjoy creating them. Thank you for sharing your aviation love story with us. You can reach us at chickswhoflyofficial@gmail.com or visit our website, chickswhofly.com. Also, if you'd like to be a more intimate part of the creation of this podcast, please check out our Patreon, Chicks Who Fly, where you can support us for as little as $3 per creation. Thank you again so much for your time. We hope to see you next time